Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for part 2 of the iridescent jacket project. Last time I drafted the pattern, cut out the various layers, and started basting together this iridescent and teal metallic lurex jacquard. And with more seed beads on the way, we can go ahead and dive into the rest of the embellishment and assembly for this project. And we left off right here at the sequining station here in my sewing parlor, where the lighting is unfortunately not always ideal, at least when there is this much sparkle going on. Because the fabric is metallic as well, it makes each individual sparkly sequin sort of hard to see. So I decided after seeing this sort of confusing footage that I should perhaps make a separate sampler to show you exactly what I'm doing here in between each of the twisted sections down the center back of this jacket. So here I am at a different desk in the same workroom in front of my machine with a piece of muslin so I can show you what I got up to. I have a single length of sewing thread on a beading needle here. These are the Beadalon beading needles that I pick up from Michaels. I can link these below. And I'm using a size 8 cupped sequin in a sort of transparent black shade with an iridescent finish. And I'm going to stitch these down in a row with the cup of the sequin facing down onto the fabric so it kind of domes out above the surface of the fabric itself. But I just take another sequin on my thread and take another stitch through the last sequin and a little ahead to create this ongoing row here, and I will be talking about exactly which stitching techniques I use when sequining in another video soon. And after I had about 1.5 inches of those sequins in place, I went ahead and went down to the next size. In this case, I only had 2 sizes of this particular colorway of sequin, so I had to go all the way down to this size 3mm sequin, which is again a cupped sequin. Normally I would prefer to have a full size range of any given sequin at my disposal so that I could go from an 8 to a 6 to a 4, to a 3, as opposed to going straight from a size 8 to the size 3, but I was making do with what I had. But I'll just dot on and sort of seed the area above what I'm working on with additional size 3 sequins just to add a little bit of sparkle and get my thread and needle back up to the center here. I kind of began down the center back and then worked my way out either side to create this kind of line in between each of the twisted fabric sections that I went over with you in the last video. And you may see Oliver walk by occasionally. That's because both he and Sophie were trying their best to help me with the sequining on both the project and this sample for you. And of course with tiny neat piles of sequins and beads, they're not exactly helpful in this process. So mostly I would just end up putting a piece of fabric over what I was working on so they couldn't mess with anything too much, playing with them for a little bit, and then coming back to what I was doing before they interrupted. But once I have this other row extended along this side the same way as I started on the first, I will again seed my way back to the center, if that makes any sense. Only if you're watching me, I suppose. And then I'm going to bring the needle up, bring the thread up through one of the centermost sequins. So I'm through the center of one of these sequins and I'll start creating my little forest of funny trees here. And to do so, I will grab a few additional materials, including some size 6mm bugle beads. These are from Mayuki, as are these little teardrop-shaped turquoise beads that I'll be using at the tops of my little trees I'm about to create. You'll see what I mean in a second. I also have some size 4 cupped sequins in a very iridescent dark green shade, and I did grab some 3mm bugles to do some shorter trees as well. I forgot to mention that. And I will begin to create my first little element here by picking up one of the bugle beads, interchanging between those and seed beads, and then threading on one of my size 8 cupped sequins with the cup facing outwards. I will then thread on one of these turquoise teardrop-shaped beads to be the top of my little tree here, and I'm going to feed my needle, and therefore thread, back through the whole of the sequin and the initial strand of beads back through the fabric at the bottom to create my first little floopy extension. Naturally, the more you hold the thread or tie the thread off at tension, the more these little trees will stand to attention, and the more thread you give them, the more they will floop around and act more like fringe. But I'm going to vary the length here by using more or less bugle beads, and just try and create a little standing fringe, especially here at the very center of the motif. I tried to keep things more dense with several strands. And then I decreased the size of the beads and sequins and the frequency of little doodads as I spaced out along the length of each section. And if I'm lucky, the cats will be off having a nap somewhere while I try and do this. But usually, well, it goes a little bit more like this. Let me just pick that cat up off of my working surface here and then peel all the sequins off the side of him before he licks them off himself. Luckily, he's not usually interested in trying to snack on this stuff. But I tried to get Oliver to sit in my lap instead while I was doing this, and even that was only partially successful. But I'm just creating a little forest of floops here, stringing on the bugle beads, topping those with a cupped sequin, then the teardrop shaped bead to truncate the whole thing, passing the needle back through everything but that top final bead, and that will hold everything at attention. Of course, the more you layer or vary the materials you're using here, the more texture you can introduce. I'm keeping everything in the same sort of color palette, but you could also mix that up as well. Especially with sequins, there are many different finishes, so there's, like the sequins I'm using here are a transparent iridescent sequin, but there are also matte sequins, there are opaque sequins, different kinds of iridescence. There's a lot of different sequins out there to play with. And as always, I will recommend Cartwright sequins, and I'll link a couple more of my favorite sequin sources below in the description as well. And I'm just going to make sure to tie off my thread on the back, so again, I can maintain the tension on these little trees so they will stand upright. A little garden of fringes, as it were. And I did just repeat this same cluster in between each of those twisted sections down the center back of the garment. And I forgot during this sampler to show these little discs I sewed on individually as well. This is a size 10 sequin, but instead of the hole being center drilled, it's off to the side. And I just pinched these and folded them in half into little tacos to again catch the light in different ways. And I sewed this in between the fringes within the forest of little beaded trees for each of those same sections. Like so, and this was only the beginning. I did have more embellishing to do on this, so I'll talk you through that later on, but for now, this was as far as I got before I decided to assemble the jacket itself. So here is my now sequined and embellished yoke, and I'm going to go ahead and line that with some of the iridescent silk taffeta. I'll just line this up along the neckline of the yoke and the hem of the yoke. The side seams will get encompassed in the arm side of the jacket itself later, so I don't need to worry about those. But I just want to make sure I finish the hem of this and the neckline of this yoke piece before I layer it onto the rest of the back. And because while I was embellishing, I tried to keep my beads and sequins out of the last ½ inch, the seam allowance around the sides of this piece, I wasn't too worried about hitting anything while stitching, but I did go ahead and switch over to my zipper foot anyhow, just so that I could get right on that ½ inch of seam allowance without interacting with any of the embellishment. This machine would sew right through a sequin, although it would eventually dull the needle if I did that more than once, I suppose, and it will sew right over a seed bead as well, although it would crack the glass and then shatter the bead, and then the little bits of glass could get into the machine, so try to avoid these things if at all possible. But because this is a curve, I will go ahead and clip my corners in curves before I turn this right side out. And again, I do have to be careful when pressing both the taffeta and the jacquard, because again, those lurex threads are just plastic and they will melt if you give them half the chance. So I'm trying to remember to use a press cloth at most steps of this process. Usually I can give things a little bit of initial heat, but then I finish the actual pressing, like the actual pressing hard and steam and all that stuff. I save that for when I have a muslin press cloth between me and the project. But I can go ahead and sew the rest of my back together here, grabbing each of my side back pieces and pinning those along the back princess seam, like so. And I will again clip the curves, and I'll use my tailor's ham to help me press that seam open. I'm not sure exactly what this jacquard is made out of other than the lurex. I'm not sure if it's a polyester or like a nylon or acetate or what it's actually made out of. Some other thermoplastic, I'm sure, but which thermoplastic, I am not. But I did feel lucky that it pressed quite well, so once I gave it a good pressing, the seams did seem to stay open, so I wasn't worried about having to top stitch these seams or anything like that. Though I did press the seams open from the inside and then press them flat again from the outside here, as you can see. First side done, let's do the other in the same way. And Oliver is again here to inspect the process. Can't give me more than 5 minutes rest, that would be unheard of. But now that the back of my jacket is fully assembled and the yoke piece is fully lined, I can go ahead and layer the yoke onto the back across the shoulders here. I'll go ahead and pin that along the shoulder seam and along the arm side, and I will actually just baste this into place so that I don't have to worry about it shifting as I assemble the rest of the jacket. I don't know much about the migration of songbirds, but I can tell you that in the last week they have all come back from wherever they have gone, because there are many birds outside singing and chirping at this point, even though none of our trees have any leaves. The birds are at least back, and my cats are thrilled, because that is their favorite TV program out the window. And even with the window closed, I can hear a cacophony going on outside my window in the tree. I can go ahead and start assembling my peplum pieces here, as it were, the lower half of my jacket. And again, I did add a little bit of curve to the back peplum pieces here. So this will cup out and away a little bit over the bum, mostly because this fabric has a bit of body to it. The jacquard is a bit crispy and the muslin adds a little bit more weight. So hopefully this will have a bit of a three-dimensional feel going on back here. Of course, the actual legit tailoring way to deal with this would be to have padding in between a lining and then this outer piece, have the curve going on. But I don't do a lot of padding or traditional tailoring just because I have no training in it. So when it comes to proper tailoring, I am always kind of faking it until I hopefully make it. But after I sew those short little, straight little seams, I can go ahead and press those open. Again, pressing the seam allowance on the back open first, using a press cloth to get these nice and smooth from both the inside and the outside. And Oliver is still being super helpful, once again, running inspections all the while. And I need to clip the curves of the back and then press those open just the same. But here you can see that curve that I said I added along this seam, as each of these pieces will stand up a little bit from the flat ironing board here. Anyhow, this is going to overlap like this, which means I can sew my side seams for the peplum before I move on, and then I will line each of these pieces as well before they get sewn into the rest of the jacket. And that is so I can have the edges where the back overlaps finished before assembly. But I'll stitch those, press them open. Because these are cut a bit on the bias, just because of lining up the other side of the pattern piece with a straight edge, it usually means that this sort of A-line tipped out side seam ends up being cut on at least 30 to 45 degrees, which allows me to press even this curved seam without having to clip it. So while it was a rule very much drilled into me to always clip my curves, I do listen to the fabric and each seam individually as I'm going through the sewing process to see if it's actually necessary. If I start to press something and it's pulling in any weird which way, I will go ahead and clip the seam, but I do try and get away with clipping as little as possible when the fabric will allow it. And speaking of side seams, I can go ahead and start assembling the side fronts. The center fronts will have to go on last here because they do not have a waist seam. So we'll get to that, but I will sew this second curved style line. Over the years, I have received a couple of questions about double princess seams, and this is, of course, one way to do it. Oftentimes when you're looking at a design that seems to have two princess seams, one is controlling the fit and the other is just there as a style line. It can be quite hard to know if they are sneaking any fit into additional style lines when there is a princess seam that goes through the apex, because you can just use that initial line for all of the fit if you want to. But I will have a video all about style lines and princess seams coming later in the year as a part of Drafting Dangerous. So we can perhaps talk about it more then. But despite this curved seam having no fit involved, it is still a bit of a pain to fit together. So I did pre-clip a little bit to help me pin this seam, and then I fully clipped the seam after it was stitched. And you can tell that this seam does not have any dart fullness in it because it will press completely flat. Remains a flat piece of fabric here because none of the shaping is done in this seam. Again, the difference between style lines and princess seams is negligible. They're both a style line, just usually princess seam is used when fit is contained, and a style line can be either. So like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares? Something like that. But I will pin and stitch the other side of the bodice front in the exact same way. And only then, once these side fronts are constructed, can I pin these along the side seams and the shoulder seams and connect these front pieces to the back. The very center front, again, will have to be the last piece I sew on, because it does not have a waist seam like the rest of this, so I have to sew the skirt, the peplum, onto the rest of the jacket before I can sew on the center front piece. Which is true for a couple of jackets I've made here on the channel before, including that last yellow silk one that I mentioned this pattern was slightly based on. And for the tipped up grown on stand collar here at the shoulder seam, I did need to put some clips into that curve to facilitate being able to press it open flat. And again, just trying to remember to use my press cloth and also even grab the tailor's clapper, being so official about it all. Again, in an effort to not melt anything. Here's how we are looking so far, and if you have an eagle eye, you can see that Oliver is still not too far away. He's still lurking in the corner. No surprise there. But back to my little skirt section, because I need to sew that on next. Before I can do that, I have to line that. The center back pieces I did line with the taffeta, because this area and the little floopy tips could flip around. I wanted them to be iridescent as well, but the rest of this I did line with a black acetate twill lining from moodfabrics.com. Not sponsored, it never is with me, as I invest in all my own materials, especially when I'm sewing for myself like this. So everyone say thank you to the patrons, because without them I wouldn't be here. But after stitching the lining along the center back and hem of this, I'm going to clip my corners and curves and give this all a nice pressing. And this would be a good area, a good edge to add in edge stitching or understitching. However, I know that I will be hand stitching beads all along this finished edge later on, so personally I don't feel I need to worry about that for this particular project. It's finally time to go ahead and pinch the little tuck that I put up here along the waist into place as well. This again creates a little bit more fullness over the bum in this skirt, again contrasting the fullness of the skirt with the hopefully visual cinching of the waist. And the folded edge of this tuck is supposed to line up with the seam line on the side back of the jacket itself. So I'll have to line that up later, but I'll just give this tuck a quick press so that it stays folded how I'd like. It'd be harder to press that later, so might as well do it now. This is how this is going to overlap in the back, and again these edges will all be beaded later on. But for now I can put it off no longer. I have to start assembling the rest of my lining. As you can see, for the center back of that I actually did use the taffeta again where it would show up at the collar, but for the rest I did cut everything out in the black lining. And I will line the bodice portion of this jacket separately, so for now I can attach the skirt pieces to the main body of the jacket at the waist, one side at a time here, because this will again overlap along the centermost back section, which results in quite a few layers to stitch through, but luckily the Cast Iron Singer 99K can handle it. And once again, the very detail-oriented may have noticed that I switched to a teal Coates & Clark thread where I was using a black Gutermann thread earlier in the project, and that is because my machine and Gutermann decided to have a tiff, and I had to switch over to a vertically stacked thread like this, so sometimes this machine has no problems with the Gutermann, and then other times we have a few weeks where things really act up. I do need to get a horizontal thread like feeder rod for this machine, but I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to set that up. Either that or switch back to using only Coates & Clark, which is hard because Mood doesn't carry it, and that's usually where I pick up my thread, just throwing it in the basket when I'm picking up other stuff. But with the skirt of the jacket fully attached at the waist, the peplum in place as it were, I can go ahead and sew on the last front piece, first matching up the notches either side of the bust to make sure I have this princess seam perfectly in place. When the princess seam goes from the apex up into the neckline, it's actually very easy to match up and sew because you're working with, instead of a convex to a concave curve like that first seam I stitched, both sides are actually a convex curve, so lining things up over the bust is super easy. The only part of the seam I had to pre-clip was actually where this comes together at the waist, because the other piece has the waist seam in it, and the center front piece has that waist seam eliminated where I taped those two pieces together during the patterning process, if you remember from the last video. And I will need to clip the curves at the waist and up here over the bust before I can press this last seam open. And I'm going to press the corner up here because I'm not going to stitch that by machine. I will just hand set that in with the lining later on, just to make sure that everything lines up exactly how I want without having to mess with it on the machine. And I will press that from the outside as well, where you can get a little bit of a look at that center panel being cut on the right side of the fabric and the rest of the jacket being cut on the wrong side, or the slightly more green side of the fabric. So the center panels on the front and then also the center back of this jacket are a little bit more blue, and then the rest is a little bit more teal. Just adds again to the shifting iridescence of it all. And now that my jacket is fully constructed, otherwise the main body of everything is all together, I can go ahead and set in my sleeves. These sleeves do have a little bit of a puff at the top, so I have 2 lines of gathering stitching in there, focusing the gathering about 1.5 inches out from either side of the shoulder seam. I made the pattern and I'm kind of lazy, so I never actually properly mark this with a notch or anything. I just do it by eye, do it by feel, distribute my gathers as the universe wills. So I'm setting the fashion fabric sleeves into the fashion fabric, the shell of the jacket itself. I will set in sleeves cut out of the lining into the lining as well, and then I will combine those 2 shells at the very end here. As opposed to doing a traditional bag lining, I am just going to go ahead and sew around certain sections of the neckline, turn everything right side out, and then finish off the lining by hand stitching things on a seam by seam basis just to get the particular kind of result I am looking for. So here I have the all black lining, well, almost all black. Again, I have certain sections of iridescence going on here, where the inside of the collar will be seen later on. I wanted to, of course, line that with something more fun. But the lining of the center front piece here is separate from the rest, hanging open at the waist there, so I did leave the last 1/2 inch of that seam open, just to give me a little bit more wiggle room when I pin this into place later by hand. But I'm going to stitch along the center front of both the skirt and the center front of the jacket itself here, up towards the peak of the neckline, but not fully around it. Then I will also stitch this by machine along the back of the neckline here, even though my iron was too hot and really threatened to just melt this tip right off the lining. Oops. Careful with the Lurex, Esposito. Thank you. What are you doing? Please do not melt anything at this late stage in the process. Pinning around the corners up here in the neckline, again pinning down towards the peaked sweetheart neckline bit of it all, where I will just do things by hand. It's easier than confusing a corner. But once I have things stitched where I need them, I will go ahead and clip my corners and curves and turn this right side out. I've left the waist completely open here, and then right on the other side of this little peaked neckline is open as well. My radiators have just come on. They're singing their clicking, groaning song. and I will start pressing everything into place. I will need to fold over the last bit of seam allowance and clean everything up along the inside of the bottom section of the jacket here. Line that up to encase and cover all of the seam allowance from sewing the skirt onto the body of the jacket earlier. So all of this will be hand slip stitched to finish. You could also fell something like this. It's not going to be seen, it's the inside of the jacket. But I just had that little bit of extra work to do at the very center front portion of the skirt because again, it was not lined with the rest of the skirt because this center front piece has no seam in it. Would it be easier just to have a seam in the center front piece? Yes. But in design, we don't always choose what is easiest. I mean, personally, I often do choose what is easiest, but occasionally I do try and be a little bit more couture about it all. Folding everything into place, pinning everything down so that I can stitch things by hand. That does give me more control over the tension of each stitch when I'm doing it by hand, section by section, and sometimes I really do want that extra bit of control. But once the rest of my lining is slip stitched into place, I just need to slip stitch the hem of my sleeves as well. So I'll line these up, matching up the underarm seam first and making sure everything fits down into place. This is why I pre-pressed the hems on these pieces earlier so that I wouldn't have to do it now, saving future me at least a few seconds of time. And yes, this has to be one of the prettiest fabrics I have ever worked with. It's just a shame I can't get any more. It would be fun to have a matching skirt as well, but again, the iridescent taffeta skirt matches perfectly well. It's the same type of lurex, takes advantage of the same type of iridescence. But I did leave myself a little bit of gap in the center bag of my jacket at the waistline between the lining and the jacket itself so that I could slip in some slim shoulder pads, and these are pretty clearly not real shoulder pads. I have just slightly steamed and loosely stitched together 2 semicircles of felt here. This is just craft felt, nothing particularly special. You could use wool felt at least, or even cotton batting, whatever you wish to puff up your shoulder pads. Once the lining is closed up, no one will have to know what you put in here. But all of the store-bought shoulder pads I have in my stash right now are 7-layer or 9-layer pads. They're much bigger than I would need in this particular garment just because I only added a 1/4 inch of tip up at the shoulder for this. If I added a 1/2 inch or more, then I probably could have gone for one of those meatier shoulder pads. But for something on the slimmer side like this, I simply had to improvise. And I'm just going to tack the center inch or so of the edge of this to the seam allowance at the top of the arm side along the sleeve puff itself. And then I'll tack the other curved side to the seam allowance along the shoulder seam as well. Just loosely whip stitching and securing these into place along that shoulder seam. I'm not worried that these are going to move around in the future just because this area will receive pretty much zero tension when I'm wearing and or storing this jacket. It's not as if I'm ever going to just toss this in the wash or something. There are delicate loops of beads all down the back of it. This is already a dry clean only, or spot clean and hope for the best sort of garment anyhow. And as I have mentioned before, when it comes to things like this that I don't really consider washable, in the same way that, say, a fully gelatin sequined 1900s bodice is not washable, I tend to take that same historic approach of wearing a shift underneath my evening bodice. So I will wear a thin t-shirt underneath this garment to provide a barrier between my actual body and the garment itself. And another option for a special occasion garment like this that is sometimes used in costuming is to make and sew in matching underarm guards. Make matching little oval pieces of fabric that can be folded over the underarm seam where your arm will fold, and you can tack those to the lining. Those can easily be taken out. Those can be washed and then tacked back in. So there are options for a special occasion garment like this when it's going to be an actual living, breathing human wearing it. And with those shoulder pads in place, I can finally close up the last of this waistline, which clearly I had left more of that open than I had remembered. But I'll turn this in on itself so that I can go ahead and slip stitch this down. Slip stitch this. Always a bit of a tongue twister for me to get those words in that particular order. And close up the messy seams of this jacket for good. Now this jacket still needs its closure, and I do prefer a center front closure as opposed to an overlap with buttons and buttonholes. Sorry, I just do. After I made the Mandragora jacket several years ago, I realized I just don't love a button front closure on a fancier jacket. I really prefer hook and eyes. Again, this really harkens back to historical evening bodices once again, so I tend to lean on a more old-fashioned way of doing things. I've gone ahead and constructed a 2-inch wide placket, the length of the center front of my jacket here, and this is boned with that flexible Ridgeline, whatever that boning is called, that I never know how to say, just to give the center front a little bit more structure, especially behind the hook and eyes. So it is serving almost a little bit like a busk would in older garments. So again, a slightly historic inspired technique in what is ultimately, I guess, a very modern jacket, although I don't think anyone would say this is a modern looking garment. To me, I think this garment is actually best for wearing to some sort of charity gala at an intergalactic aquarium, but that's just me. I will pin the placket in place down the left side of the center front, and I will stitch that by machine, stitching right through the boning that is part of the placket here. Then I sewed, I think it was 9 or 10 hooks down the right side of the jacket, and then I sewed the bars down onto the placket itself, and then I stitched iridescent check glass buttons down along the placket so that this jacket from far away looks like it buttons, but without me having to do any of the additional work to achieve said buttons. It's a false button, just like, again, say it with me, many historic garments, honestly, because throughout time it has always been fiddly to make dozens of buttonholes or button loops. It again requires a different kind of patience than I have. I have patience instead for sequining, which is what I am going to continue with now that the rest of the jacket is finished. So over the seams along the back, this is along the back princess seam here, I'm stitching on some layered square sequins held in place by a bead and some beads in between each of those. And like I mentioned earlier, I am also going to bead the entire edge, the hem of the jacket, the hem of the sleeves, the hem, or like the edges of the collar area, just trying to give this whole garment an extra crystallized layer of sparkling dew. And I will be showing exactly how I go about beading edges of things like this, finished edges like this, in an upcoming video where I'll be focusing on embellishment techniques. And for easy access, I do just have this jacket hanging on a hanger and then have that hanger hanging from one of my light stands down here in the studio. But depending on how my shoulders feel or how much cat interference I am currently dealing with, sometimes it helps to work vertically like this, or sometimes I have the jacket laying in my lap. Again, I'm only taking stitches out of the fashion fabric layers. None of these stitches go through all the way to the lining, so I'm not tacking the lining weirdly in places where I shouldn't. And yes, my fingertips here are slightly stained by beetroot. Let's not talk about it. But I wanted to show you one last little embellishment trick I used on this piece, just because it's harder to bead the fringe once the garment is fully constructed like this. It's much easier when that piece was sitting flat in my hands, fully manipulatable. But at this point, it's much easier to attach the fringe to something else and then sew that something else to the finished garment itself, because it's too far down the line of completion at this point to be adding fringe. And yet I wasn't going to let that stop me. So I grabbed these sort of ring-shaped hexagon loop sequins, and then I will string on my fringes, starting with some seed beads and those same 6mm bugles from earlier. And I have some size 6 turquoise beads that are going to stand in for my teardrop beads, because I've run out of those at this point. But these will still truncate my fringe just fine. I will stick the needle back through the strand of beads so that that last little seed bead on the end holds my fringe in place. I will pull this taut, and then I will string on another strand of fringe, string on another strand. It's time for my coffee break, I'll tell you that much. I might even actually go for a walk, although it's quite rainy and foggy outside. It is 59 degrees, which is just balmy compared to what we've been having recently. But I'm just going to keep beading strands of fringe onto this little loop here, again, slipping my thread into knots around the hoop itself, filling this with fringe, creating a slightly swishy section of sea urchin, as it were. And where my thread has gotten a little bit thick around the hoop itself, I will just create a smaller loop of beads to cover that up. Not that anyone will ever be looking this closely, let's face it. Alright, now this was the section I felt was missing a little bit of fringe. Just underneath in here, underneath some of the other fringe that I had added initially. But I'm just going to stitch on this little doodad that I've made to quickly fill in this section with a little bit more fringe, even though the jacket is otherwise finished. And stitching anything at this point is much more annoying because of course I have floops and fringes that my thread and needle want to get caught on all the while. And I did sneak in a few flat-backed crystal sort of beads back here. These are actually not actual crystal, they're not glass, they're not Preciosa or Swarovski or anything like that. They are just plastic faux crystals, but I reconciled that with myself because I figured all the sequins are plastic, so really I'm keeping the plastic theme going. The rest of this jacket is already not exactly biodegradable, but I can link to where I found those additional embellishments below as well. And in general, I was just adding my last final floops and fringes, even while under pretty constant surveillance. And here is what the finished evening jacket looks like, evening bodice looks like when paired with the iridescent taffeta skirt that I mentioned making earlier in the year. And just as planned, these do pair together perfectly, even though I acquired each of these fabrics from not only a different shop, but a different country. In the end, I'm glad I took the extra time to put this jacket together the way I really wanted to, did the extra beadwork, waited for the correct seed beads to arrive in the mail so I could finish what I had started, and hopefully someone will open up a 1,000 Leagues Under the Sea mermaid-themed cocktail bar in my town soon. It doesn't seem likely, but I've learned at this point that really anything can happen. Thank you as always for watching today, and I'll be back here with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!